The wheels clattered against the rails with a metallic rhythm, each strike a reminder that the world these men had known was gone. A troop train cut across the Oklahoma prairie in November 1943, its windows barred, its carriages filled with soldiers who were no longer soldiers. They were prisoners now, men of Rommel's Africa Corps, taken in Tunisia, once proud in their field-gray uniforms, now reduced to silent observers of a country they had only known through propaganda. Sergeant Carl Weiss sat with his back against the hard wooden bench, staring past his reflection in the glass toward an unfamiliar landscape. The fields seemed to stretch without end, golden and swaying as though the earth itself could feed an army. Weiss had expected hostility, perhaps jeers from civilians, maybe even cruelty from the guards. Yet as the train slowed near small stations, he saw children running alongside, waving flags no larger than handkerchiefs. Women in cotton dresses carried baskets of food to the American soldiers posted by the doors. Farmers tipped their hats, offering water pails as if war had not turned the world upside down. It was bewildering to men who had been told that America was soft, a nation of dreamers incapable of serious struggle. Weiss remembered the speeches drilled into them. America was nothing more than jazz music, cheap automobiles, and farmers who could not imagine hardship. But through the barred glass he saw not softness but abundance. The guards themselves were not cruel. Corporal James Haskins, barely 20, leaned against the doorway with an M1 Garand slung across his shoulder. He did not bark orders or spit insults. He simply stood his watch, calm and steady, the way a farmer stands in his field waiting for a storm to pass. His uniform smelled faintly of dust and oil, his helmet a little loose, his boots not yet broken in. He looked more like a neighbor's son than a warrior, but the rifle he carried was more modern than most weapons Weiss's unit had brought into Africa. Outside, the prairie rolled on, dotted with cattle and punctuated by the black lines of oil derricks rising against the horizon. Weiss pressed his forehead to the glass, thinking of Germany's ration lines, of mothers scraping together potatoes from a bare pantry. Here, the land itself seemed to overflow, and the sight gnawed at him. If this was the country they were fighting, then perhaps the fight had been doomed from the beginning. The train whistle screamed into the cold evening as the cars lurched, beginning their final approach to Camp Tonkawa. The fences would be high, the barracks bare, yet already something deeper than wire was closing in on these prisoners. It was not the guard towers or the rifles. It was the undeniable wealth of a nation that seemed to waste more in a day than Germany could produce in a month. Weiss exhaled, the glass fogging before him, and whispered in German, "No one back home will believe this." The morning after the train arrived, Corporal James Haskins walked the fence line of Camp Tonkawa with the awkward determination of a man new to soldiering but old to hard work. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened soil, breath rising in the cold air. He had grown up only 40 miles away, son of a wheat farmer, and the land beneath his feet was as familiar to him as the rhythm of harvest. But the task before him, watching over captured Germans, veterans of a desert war he had only read about in papers, felt unreal. He carried his M1 Garand across his chest, the walnut stock smooth under his palm. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds, nearly twice what his grandfather's shotgun had weighed, but it fired with a precision and rapidity that no German bolt action could match. Haskins had heard the statistics in training. The Garand gave American infantrymen a rate of fire that doubled their enemies. To him, those numbers had been abstract. Now, standing over men who once fought under Rommel's command, the rifle was both reassurance and responsibility. Inside the wire, the prisoners moved with the stiffness of men stripped of rank and purpose. They lined up for roll call, their breath steaming, their field-gray jackets still carrying faint stains of desert dust. To Haskins, They looked less like conquerors and more like tired farm hands awaiting instructions. He heard whispers from local townsfolk that these POWs were dangerous, perhaps still loyal to the Reich, perhaps plotting escape, but watching them shuffle toward the mess hall, he saw a little menace. Hunger, perhaps. Resentment, certainly. But menace? Number. Camp Tonkawa was laid out with military efficiency. Wooden barracks in rows, each with a potbelly stove, guard towers on the corners, a double fence topped with barbed wire. It was not meant to break men, but to contain them. Regulations under the Geneva Convention were clear, and Captain Bentley enforced them without hesitation. Prisoners would be fed, housed, and even given work if they wished. That evening, Haskins lingered outside the mess hall. The smell of cornbread and beans drifted on the air, stronger than any ration his father had known in the lean years of the Depression. Through the open doorway, he saw German prisoners eating quietly, their hollow cheeks filling as they chewed. For a moment he remembered his own childhood suppers, beans stretched over days, bread dry as chalk, and realized the irony. These men, once hailed as Hitler's desert warriors, were eating better in captivity than many Oklahomans had during the worst of the 30s. As lights flickered out and the prairie fell quiet, Haskins adjusted his helmet and walked the fence again. They were prisoners, yes, but not monsters. He could not yet see what they would soon realize, that the very food on their trays, the rifle in his hands, and the endless land around them were all parts of a system that would grind tyranny to dust. The first real thaw between prisoner and local came on a late November afternoon, when the sun dipped low over the wheat fields and the POW work detail labored alongside farmers. Sergeant Carl Weiss bent his back against the task, his hands blistering on a borrowed hoe. The soil was different here, rich, dark, stubborn, and the machines that roared past him were unlike anything he had seen in Germany. Great combines moved across the fields with a noise like thunder, chewing wheat in gulps that would have taken whole squads of men to harvest by hand. Weiss stole glances at the tractors, their engines coughing black smoke, their tires taller than a man. In Germany, farmers still relied on horses. Machinery was rare, fuel scarcer still. Here, even in this so-called backwater, the fields seemed to sprout iron beasts as naturally as they sprouted grain. The sight unsettled him more than any American weapon. As the prisoners of war worked, local families watched from the fence line. Among them stood Anna Whitaker, her hair tied back with a red kerchief, a basket clutched in her arms. She was young, perhaps 17, her face sunburned from harvest days. When the prisoners paused to drink water, she approached with a shy smile and offered sticks of chewing gum through the wire. Weiss hesitated. To accept candy from the hand of a farmer's daughter, was this weakness? Around him, some comrades muttered disdain, their pride still brittle, but hunger and curiosity overruled. He reached out, and Anna pressed the gum into his palm. He peeled the paper back and tasted sweetness, unlike anything he remembered. It was trivial, almost absurd, yet it struck him deeply. Back home, children scavenged for crusts. Here, they gave candy away to prisoners. The gum was not just sugar, it was proof of plenty. That evening the men returned to camp with stories. One claimed the Whitaker family had lent him gloves to save his hands from blistering. Another described tractors lined up in sheds, more machines on one farm than his entire village in Bavaria could have imagined. Weiss lay awake on his bunk, staring at the rafters, chewing the last of Anna's gum. The flavor lingered faintly, a sweetness against the bitterness in his mind. For the first time he wondered if everything he had been told about America was wrong. If this land could give candy to strangers, waste corn in piles, and build machines to do men's work, what else was it capable of? Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the barbed wire, carrying the scent of wheat and oil. Weiss closed his eyes and dreamed not of Berlin but of bread, warm, plentiful, unending. The Oklahoma sun could be merciless even in early summer, beating down on the wide fields until the air shimmered. On one such day, Carl Weiss felt sweat sting his eyes as he guided a scythe through the wheat rows, his back aching from the rhythm. Around him, prisoners moved in silence, the clink of tools punctuated by the roar of tractors. What unnerved him was not the heat, but the speed of the harvest. American farmers directed machines with practiced ease, their engines coughing and rumbling as they swallowed acres in hours. It was a sight that defied everything the German sergeant thought he knew about farming. In Germany, the war had drained fuel and machinery, forcing fields back to horses and hand labor. Here, even in this Dust Bowl state whispered about in propaganda, the land glittered with abundance. The tractors gleamed under the sun, some bearing names he had never heard: John Deere, International Harvester. Their tires rose taller than men, their belts spun with power. Each machine replaced dozens of workers, and each acre seemed to yield more than entire German villages. Weiss wiped his brow, glancing at the endless horizon, and felt a cold realization cut through the heat. This was only one state, one farm, one glimpse into America's capacity. Nearby, Corporal Haskins leaned on a fence rail, helmet tipped back as he watched the labor. He marveled at the same machines, though for him they were the inheritance of his childhood. To see Germans gape at tractors amused him. He recalled how his father used to boast that one combine could thresh more wheat in a day than 100 men. The numbers seemed like bragging until he saw the disbelief on enemy faces. The prisoners returned at dusk, their arms aching, but their bellies full from rations that still astonished them: meat, beans, fresh bread, butter. Weiss chewed slowly, remembering rations back home: watery cabbage soup, bread stretched with sawdust, potatoes measured out by the state. The contrast gnawed at his pride. America could feed its prisoners like kings, while Germany struggled to feed its citizens. Lying on his bunk, Weiss thought of Anna Whitaker's candy, of tractors roaring like thunder, of the bread on his plate. Each detail was trivial in isolation. Together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. If this was America's backwater, what were its cities, its factories, its arsenals capable of? The prairie wind rattled the barracks siding, and Weiss knew the answer would come soon enough. Night fell hard on Camp Tonkawa, the barracks dim except for the glow of stoves. The men spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the bitterness of defeat and the stubborn pride of loyalty. In Block A, the tension finally cracked. Johannes Kunze, a fellow prisoner accused of collaboration, had been marked. Whispered accusations spread that he was informing on escape plans, that his words had reached the Americans. For men still chained to the ideology of the Reich, betrayal could not be forgiven. Weiss lay on his bunk when the scuffle began. Boots thudded against wood, muffled shouts, a cry cut short. By morning, Kunze was dead, his body hidden in the latrine pit. The camp awoke to silence heavier than any guard's command. The Americans moved quickly. Captain Harold Bentley, commander of the camp, summoned interpreters, questioned prisoners, and ordered guards to seal the barracks. For him, there was no question. This was murder, and it would be answered. The barracks themselves were plain: wooden walls, two-tier bunks, each stove venting smoke through tin chimneys. But within them, German order had replicated itself, complete with secret courts and whispered loyalty to Berlin. Now that fragile hierarchy had exposed its brutality. The Americans investigated with precision. Military police scoured for witnesses. Interpreters pressed men who avoided eye contact. Bentley studied each face, his jaw set. He knew the Geneva Convention demanded fair treatment, but it also demanded order. If law did not rule the camp, chaos would. The Germans muttered among themselves, some approving, others afraid. For Weiss, it was a moment of fracture. He had served beside men capable of loyalty unto death, but here he saw them turn inward, tearing down one of their own. The act was familiar, Gestapo methods, SS justice, but to witness it within wire fenced by Americans gave it a different weight. When Kunze's body was found, the camp's silence broke into shock. The Americans announced a trial would be held, not vengeance. Bentley made his stance clear. America would not tolerate murder even among enemies. The Germans watched warily. To them, trials were political theater. Verdicts in Germany were foregone conclusions. Here, the process itself carried weight. As guards marched the accused toward interrogation, Weiss stared at the dust rising under their boots. The Reich had promised order, yet here it was, America delivering justice. Even to men, it had every reason to despise. The morning of July 10, 1945, broke clear over Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. 5 German prisoners convicted of the murder of Johannes Kunze were marched under guard to the gallows. Their boots clacked against the wooden boards with mechanical finality, the echo carrying farther than their voices. They had denied the charges, then admitted them under questioning, insisting they acted under the code of honor instilled by the Reich. But America would not allow such lawlessness, even inside its own prison camps. Karl Weiss stood among the other POWs confined at Tonkawa, hearing second-hand reports of the executions. He imagined the floodlights, the rope, the sudden silence. In Germany, executions were tools of terror. Gestapo dawn raids, public hangings meant to intimidate. Here they came as verdicts after trial, carried out not in rage, but in solemnity. That difference cut deeper than the rope. Captain Harold Bentley had traveled to Leavenworth to observe. He watched as the Army chaplain read final prayers, as each man mounted the steps, as the hangman's hood was drawn. The mechanism was swift, efficient, and above all, legal. Bentley knew word would ripple back to every camp in the country. Order had been restored, not by fear but by process. The camp at Tonkawa received the news in silence. Some prisoners muttered that Kunze had deserved death. Others feared they might be next if accused. Weiss felt the weight of contradiction. He had believed America soft, a land without discipline. Yet here was discipline sharper than Germany's, tempered by law instead of ideology. That evening, as the prairie wind carried the smell of wheat and summer dust, Weiss thought of the men who had swung at Leavenworth. They had followed the Reich's code of vengeance and paid with their lives. America had responded with swiftness and restraint, proving that strength did not require cruelty. It was, in its way, more terrifying than brutality. For if America could show mercy and still hang murderers without hesitation, what else could it do? The camp fell quiet that night, the barracks filled with uneasy dreams. The Germans had been judged not by their comrades, but by the enemy, and in that judgment lay a revelation. America's power came not just from machines or rations, but from a system of order that even war could not shatter. Weeks later, Weiss found himself assigned to a work detail outside the wire, clearing brush near a supply depot. The day was hot, cicadas buzzing in the trees, the smell of gasoline thick in the air. At first, he noticed only the clatter of trucks, the distant hum of engines. Then, as they rounded a corner, the sight froze him. Row upon row of vehicles stretched before him, jeeps, trucks, half-ton transports, all gleaming under the sun. The motor pool sprawled across the depot yard like an army unto itself. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, stood ready, each marked with the white star of the U.S. Army. The prisoners stopped working, their tools forgotten, their eyes wide. Weiss's throat tightened. In North Africa, his unit had fought over a handful of trucks, rationing fuel, patching engines with wire. Here, He counted more jeeps than an entire panzer division possessed in motor transport. The Americans produced them by the hundreds of thousands, 640,000 in all. One depot yard in Oklahoma held more vehicles than Rommel had commanded at El Alamein. Corporal Haskins, watching from the shade, noticed the stunned faces. He felt a flicker of pride. To him, the jeeps were ordinary, tools no more exotic than a tractor. But to these Germans, the sight was revelation. He overheard Weiss mutter to another prisoner, voice low and bitter, "Germany could not build in 10 years what America throws away in a month." The numbers bore him out. Where Germany struggled to replace vehicles lost in battle, America built them faster than they could be shipped overseas. One factory in Michigan could outproduce all of Germany's wartime truck plants combined. The sheer arithmetic made resistance meaningless. That evening, Weiss sat on his bunk in silence. The Reich had promised victory through will, through discipline, through blood and sacrifice. But what he had seen was not willpower, it was abundance. Trucks lined like grain stalks, a harvest of steel that no soldier's courage could overcome. As darkness settled over Camp Tonkawa, the hum of engines still echoed in his ears. For the first time, Weiss admitted to himself what no propaganda had ever prepared him for. The war was already lost. It was a newspaper that delivered the next blow. The Americans allowed camp libraries, and occasionally the guards passed on discarded issues of the Daily Oklahoman or Kansas City Star. One autumn morning in 1944, a paper made its way into the hands of the prisoners. Its front page bore a grainy photograph. A Liberty ship sliding into the Atlantic, its hull still dripping from the slipway. Workers in hard hats cheering as the vessel took water for the first time. The caption declared it had been completed in just 17 days. Weiss stared at the picture until his eyes blurred. 17 days. In Germany, building a freighter was a matter of months, often years. Fuel shortages, Allied bombing raids, and labor drawn from slave camps made every keel a tortured endeavor. Yet here, in American yards from Portland to Baltimore, ships were launched faster than U-boats could sink them. He read the numbers with disbelief. 2,710 Liberty ships already produced, another 534 Victory ships planned, each carrying enough supplies to keep whole armies in the field. The other prisoners gathered, reading in hushed tones, some shaking their heads, others falling into silence. A few muttered that the statistics were Allied lies. But Weiss knew better. He remembered watching his unit stranded in North Africa, supplies cut off, fuel dwindling to fumes. He remembered letters from home about German civilians surviving on rutabagas. No propaganda could disguise the truth standing in black and white ink. America was flooding the seas with steel. Captain Bentley kept one of those clippings pinned to the wall of his office. To him, it was more than industrial triumph. It was strategy. The U-boat campaign that had once threatened Britain was being strangled by sheer numbers. Each Liberty ship represented not just steel and rivets, but food, ammunition, tanks, and bombers crossing the Atlantic unhindered. "Even the ocean belongs to us now," he remarked to a visiting officer. At evening roll call, Weiss could still see the ship in his mind's eye, towering and new, a vessel that carried not just cargo, but the weight of inevitability. For every German submarine that prowled the Atlantic, dozens of American ships surged forward. What use was courage when drowned beneath such a tide? The barracks lights dimmed, but sleep evaded him. He kept picturing the photograph, sparks flying, cranes swinging, American workers cheering. It was not the battlefield he feared anymore. It was the factory floor. The sound came first, low, distant, like thunder rolling across the prairie. The prisoners working in the fields straightened, shading their eyes. Over the horizon came the gleam of sunlight on aluminum. A formation of bombers filled the sky, engines droning in unison. their shadows sweeping the earth like a tide. Weiss craned his neck, mouth dry, as one wave passed, then another, then another. The Americans called them flying fortresses. To him, they looked like a metal storm. The B-17s flew in precise boxes, dozens of aircraft moving as one body. Each carried 10 crewmen, heavy machine guns in every direction, and bomb loads that could level factories. Weiss had read German reports of such raids, but the scale defied words. On this single afternoon, more aircraft passed over Oklahoma than his Luftwaffe comrades could muster for an entire campaign. He later learned the numbers. In 1944 alone, America built 96,318 aircraft, more than Germany's total output in the entire war. Anna Whitaker stood near the fence, basket on her arm, and looked skyward too. The planes glinted like silver fish swimming across the blue. To her, they were protective, symbols that her brothers overseas were not alone. She glanced at the POWs and saw their faces pale as each new formation roared overhead. Corporal Haskins explained in quiet pride that the planes were bound for Europe, ferried through training bases before crossing the Atlantic. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. For them, every shadow meant another German city burned, another rail yard torn apart, another soldier cut off from supply. They did not see bombers. They saw inevitability. Weiss clenched his jaw as engines thundered past, rattling the very air. He thought of German civilians huddling in basements, the firestorms consuming Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. He thought of the Luftwaffe aces who once ruled the skies, now grounded by lack of fuel and spare parts. Against this storm, even the bravest pilot was a feather in the wind. As the last wave disappeared, silence fell heavy. The cicadas resumed their buzz, the prairie wind bent the wheat, but the men did not return to work right away. They stood staring at the horizon, as though expecting the sky itself to fall. That night, Weiss lay awake with the drone still in his ears. Numbers turned over in his mind. Tens of thousands of planes, hundreds of thousands of crew, an industrial miracle that dwarfed anything Germany could dream of. For the first time, he admitted what the Reich never would. The sky belonged to America now. And where the sky belonged, so too would the war. By late 1944, statistics themselves had become weapons. In the camp library, prisoners passed around a pamphlet issued by the War Department, meant for American morale but devoured by German eyes. It listed figures so vast they read like impossibilities. 88,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 372,000 artillery pieces, 20 million small arms, more than 300,000 aircraft. Weiss traced the columns with his finger as though by touching the numbers he might prove them false. He remembered the Africa Corps scrambling to keep a handful of panzers running, cannibalizing broken vehicles for parts. In Tunisia, they had counted every shell, every liter of fuel. Here, the enemy manufactured more in a single year than Germany could hope for in a decade. One factory in Detroit produced more tanks than the entire Reich. Another in Kansas turned out bombers by the hour. At Willow Run, the B-24 Liberator rolled off assembly lines at the rate of 1 per 63 minutes. That single plant produced more aircraft than Italy managed during the entire war. Captain Bentley spoke candidly when asked by a local reporter, "We don't fight battles only at the front. We fight them with payrolls, with rivets, with crops in the ground." He gestured toward the POWs working in the fields. Even they can see the difference. America is not only a nation of farmers, it is a nation of factories, and those factories feed the front. The prisoners absorbed the figures with a mixture of awe and despair. Some dismissed them as Allied propaganda, but their empty silences betrayed belief. Weiss could not shake the image of the motor pool, the Liberty ships, the endless bombers overhead. Now the numbers gave those images weight, arithmetic that rendered resistance meaningless. That evening he sat with fellow prisoners in the barracks reading by lantern light. He murmured, half to himself, the war was decided not by blood, but by arithmetic. No one answered. They all knew it was true. The lantern flickered out, leaving the room in darkness, but the numbers glowed in Weiss's mind. They were more relentless than bullets, more crushing than bombs. The Reich had built its empire on force and fear. America built victory on production lines and democratic order. Winter deepened across Oklahoma, the prairie winds cutting through thin coats, yet the barracks stayed warm with wood stoves and steady rations. Weiss sat at a table one evening, pencil scratching across the thin paper of a Red Cross letter form. Each word was censored, every line reviewed by American staff, but still he wrote. He told his family that he was healthy, that food was plentiful, that work in the fields was hard but fair. What he did not write was the truth that weighed on him, that America's abundance had shaken his faith in Germany's cause. Other prisoners wrote too, careful with their phrasing. They spoke of kind civilians, of children handing out gum, of bread never in short supply. Between the lines, they smuggled a message. America was not the monster they had been told to fear. In town, Anna Whitaker noticed how the POW labor eased her family's burden. The harvest was stronger than ever, wheat piled high in silos. She remembered the Depression years when meals had been stretched thin, when dust had choked the fields. Now, with German hands guiding plows and hauling sacks, abundance returned. She watched the men work silently, their pride slowly softening into something like resignation. Corporal Haskins, preparing for possible deployment overseas, wrote his own letters home. He described guarding men who once served Rommel, men who now bent their backs to Oklahoma soil. He told his mother not to worry, that they were not dangerous, that in many ways they seemed more bewildered than threatening. He did not mention the moments when he caught them staring at the horizon as if searching for a Germany that no longer existed. The letters crossed oceans, filtered through censors, arriving weeks later in bombed-out towns. German families unfolded them under candlelight, reading between the lines. They heard whispers of food, of machines, of a nation that had more than enough even for its enemies. It was a revelation more powerful than any radio broadcast. At Tonkawa, Weiss sealed his letter and handed it to the guard. He watched the envelope disappear into a mailbag bound for Europe. In that moment, he understood that his words carried more than reassurance. They carried testimony. If his family could read between the lines, they would know what he had realized, that the war was lost not by battle alone, but by the weight of a nation that wasted more than Germany possessed. The spring of 1946 brought departure. Trains once again pulled into Tonkawa, this time to carry the prisoners home. Weiss stood on the platform, heavier now than when he had arrived, his face fuller, his eyes older. The Americans handed out Red Cross parcels for the journey, cans of meat, chocolate, cigarettes. He accepted them in silence, the irony cutting deep. He would return to a Germany hollowed by hunger, carrying food given freely by the enemy. Anna Whitaker watched from the crowd gathered near the fence. She waved once, shyly, as the prisoners boarded. Weiss caught her gesture and lifted his hand in reply, uncertain whether it was farewell or acknowledgement of something larger. He remembered the gum she had given him, the sweetness that lingered even when hope had soured. Corporal Haskins stood with his rifle slung across his shoulder, though the gesture felt ceremonial now. These men were no longer enemies. They were shadows of a war ending. He thought of his own brothers still overseas, of how America's might had carried them across oceans and would now bring them home. Weiss settled into the train car as it lurched forward, the prairie rolling past in waves of green and gold. He thought of the tractors, the Liberty ships, the endless bombers, He thought of the trial at Leavenworth, of the food in the mess hall, of the children waving flags at the station. Piece by piece, the image of America had remade itself in his mind. No longer a land of soft dreamers, it was a machine of democracy, turning wheat and steel into freedom, overwhelming tyranny not only with weapons but with abundance. As the train carried him eastward, he wrote one final line in his journal. In Oklahoma, I realized America was never the enemy, it was the future. The whistle blew, carrying the sound across the wide land, mingling with the prairie wind. Behind him, the camp faded into distance. Ahead lay a broken homeland, and beyond it, a world reshaped by the impossible statistics of American might. For Weiss, the revelation would endure. Victory had not been forged in cruelty, but in generosity, in numbers too vast to deny, in a nation that built freedom by the ton and delivered it across the seas.